This is the BioCentury Show. Brought to you by the 24th BioEquity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair ECO's Capital for Biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world.
I'm Steve Usdin, and today I'm speaking with John Crowley. John's the first return guest on the BioCentury Show. We spoke last October when he was executive chair of Amicus. Now, of course, he's president and CEO of Bio. John, thanks for taking the time to speak with me. You didn't really have a lot of time to ease into the job. In your first week in Washington, a member of Congress accused Bio of being an unregistered foreign agent because it had opposed a Senate bill that's similar to the Biosecure Act. Bio's opposition to that bill came in February, before you came on board. In March, a few days after you started, Bio reversed its position. It endorsed the bill and it parted ways with WuXi AppTec, which had been a member for some time. Can you explain why?
Yeah, first of all, Steve, thank you for having me on. I didn't realize I was the first return guest, so that's a privilege. You summarized it very well. My first 8 hours on the job were a great, coming into the Bio organization, a great organization of really passionate entrepreneurs who want to make a difference in biotech. And about 5 o'clock that evening, I found out about Congressman Gallagher's letter to the Attorney General. And so in many ways, perhaps running a biotechnology company for more than 19 years was good preparation for a crisis, because it seems like in biotech, in the world of running our companies, it's crisis mode every day. And for me, it's something we took very, very seriously, right? It touched on a number of different issues. You had policy and politics. You had member relations, you had potential legal implications. What we thought about over that couple of day period was every one of those. The guiding principle for us is one of my 7 strategic priorities. And that's, as you and I have discussed, advancing biotechnology as a national security imperative. So for me, that was a very important framework to look at this. And that was a guiding principle. And it was very clear what needed to be done. With that as a guiding principle, with the overall mission of Bio, we needed to ensure that we were acting in the interests of the United States and our allies for biotechnology broadly. So we retracted the prior letter. We issued a new letter from myself directly to Congressman Gallagher, where we indicated that we would support the Biosecure Act. We support national security initiatives on behalf of the United States and our allies. We reiterated the importance of the entire bioeconomy and the biosphere for advancing national security, both from a public health standpoint, as well as an instrument of national power, to show what free and democratic societies can do. We also had one of our member companies voluntarily resign at our request from the organization. We had just reached a point where there was a conflict of interest, and we all agreed that needed to happen. So I think by doing all of that, by being responsive and doing it in a very, very forceful way, I think we restored the credibility and the position of this organization unambiguously in support of national security, of our member companies, and ultimately of patients who need to benefit from our medicines. And also, too, realizing that any decoupling from any significant company or broadly from the China-based supply chain is going to take time. And we need to be thoughtful about that to make sure that we, again, don't harm our companies, but most importantly, don't harm patients. And thereby will take a very important role in collecting the data, the case studies, to show just how complex this is and to make sure we proceed in a very thoughtful way. So that was my first week on the job.
So I want to ask you about some of those issues and about the pain really that would be caused by decoupling, especially if it happens abruptly. But first, I want to press you a little bit on to explain what you mean by conflict of interest and what you mean by national security issues. What are the national security issues in your mind associated with having a Chinese CDMO as a member of Bio, or with the U.S. biotech companies hiring Chinese companies to do manufacturing and research?
Well, the United States is the world's medicine chest. We are the center of excellence for biotechnology. And we leverage, a broad international ecosphere as well. And that's very important. So when you talk about national security, again, it means making sure whether it's around biopreparedness from a pandemic perspective or bioterrorism, God forbid, broadly supporting a strong and vibrant public health system. But again, also, being able to leverage that. There is a great global rivalry going on right now. And we have, what we're talking about is defending broad principles and a broad way of life, and to showcasing what, again, free and democratic societies, free enterprise-based systems can produce. We've had such amazing success in developing some remarkable medicines, therapies, vaccines, and we need to continue as that center of excellence. So for us, it was very clear that, the supply chain has become, very global. We don't do much biomanufacturing in the United States anymore. We saw the challenges of disrupted supply chains throughout COVID. We need to make sure that we have a very serious and concerted effort to re-onshore much of that manufacturing here in the United States. And that's one critical component of growing a vibrant and robust biotechnology industry. So that's what I mean by national security, why it's important.
So re-onshoring, as you put it, developing biomanufacturing in the United States is something that's going to take time, and it's going to take money, and it's going to take intentional policies.
Exactly.
The Biosecure Act would effectively force drug developers to stop using Chinese contract manufacturers right away. And the version that's been passed the Senate Homeland Security Committee would grandfather in existing contracts, but would prevent future ones. So BioCentury did a survey. We heard from over 100 companies that use Chinese CDMOs, and 90% of them said that the Biosecure Act, as it was written, would cause delays in drug development programs. 64% of them said the slowdown would be substantial. And I'm sure you've heard from some of your members some of these concerns. What's your response to those concerns? What can or should be done to ensure that legislation that passes Congress doesn't interrupt ongoing drug development programs or future drug development programs?
Yeah, and again, thanks to BioCentury, Steve, for doing that. I think that's important to get those facts out. Bio, our organization, is going to be going out with a very detailed survey to dig even deeper into the implications of decoupling. We'll have some very specific case studies. So when you think about what we did by supporting Biosecure, the broad principles of Biosecure, the act itself, we've talked about that, the importance of national security, of a reemergence and a renaissance further of biomanufacturing in the United States. It's very important, though, that policymakers, lawmakers understand that you can't do this in a rash way. So by taking the stance that we have, it gives us credibility, but it also gives us a seat at the table to be able to articulate these facts, to show exactly what you guys demonstrated, in a very important and high-level way through your survey, that this decoupling can't be immediate, that we need to be thoughtful about which companies are impacted. We cannot slow research and development for all these important newer and better medicines. And we need to understand down to the individual level, which diseases are impacted if we take these actions, and how do we have a thoughtful program and process for building this capacity in the United States. It's not just the facilities and the capacity and the equipment that goes in there, it's the capabilities. So workforce training. So this is going to be a key part of what we talk about in the months and years ahead, is what we need to make sure that we don't harm research and development, and we don't harm patients. So we need to be very thoughtful about this decoupling. And you're right, it's not going to happen. It can't happen immediately. It needs to be a thoughtful, systemic decoupling from this broad infrastructure where we have concerns.
So I've heard from biomember companies also that they're concerned about, where does the national security issue go? Does it stop with CDMOs or genomics companies, or does it include therapeutics companies? Senator Rubio, for example, has sharply criticized Moderna, a biomember, for building mRNA manufacturing facilities in China. A number of biopharma CEOs have been in China over the last month, expressing their intention to serve the Chinese market and collaborate on R&D. There are several companies with roots in China that are biomembers. Can you talk about, kind of where does this concern? And you've said, decoupling a few times. How far does that go? Does that extend to the therapeutics companies? Does it extend to R&D and manufacturing collaboration of US and European companies in China?
Well, together with national security as a priority, Steve, let's also make sure we understand the importance of our industry to serve a global population. And that includes the 1.4 billion people who live in China, who also have the need for these, all the medicines, therapeutics, the vaccines that we develop. The purpose cannot be that we don't serve a global universal population. Now, where we base facilities, many, many companies have manufacturing, distribution, commercial activities in China and other countries as well, potentially of concern. What we need to do is to make sure that, that work isn't interrupted in a way that would harm the companies and a way that would harm patients. But we do need more here in the United States as well. But I do think that we can get to that by promoting incentives and policies that give people a reason to want to build these facilities in the United States and in our allied nations. So I think, again, the broad principles apply, but when we start critiquing individual companies, I think we need to be very, very thoughtful about the role that each plays. Obviously, Moderna has played a life-saving role in not just the battle against COVID, but in so many other therapeutic areas, an incredibly important company in this ecosystem.
So you mentioned that changing Bio's position on the Biosecure Act gives it a seat at the table. Have you or has anybody else from Bio engaged in conversations either with Representative Gallagher, who's leaving, or other members of Congress who are actively working on the Biosecure Act or similar legislation? Have you had conversations with them about where this might go and how you might get changes in it to reflect the kind of things we've been talking about?
Yeah, very important, Steve. We've reached out proactively to key members of Congress and policymakers, and they've also begun calling us, both at the committee level and individual members. So that will be a really important part of the role that I can play, that Bio can play in making sure that people understand exactly how complex this global supply chain is and how thoughtful and how sensitive we need to be to any efforts to decouple manufacturing from any particular company or any geography. It's kind of like the first rule of medicine, right? Do no harm. Start with that principle.
Yeah, so that's what I want to get a sense for you, because I think a lot of people are confused. I'm confused about what's going to happen next. What are you telling your companies when they're calling you and asking you, where is this legislation going and what's the timeline on it? When can they expect to see something passed, and how likely is it to be substantially different from what we're seeing today?
Yeah, I'm not surprised that there's confusion, there's uncertainty, because frankly, there is down the street here at the Hill, right? So let's see where we are. We had the Homeland Security Committee adopted the Biosecure Act in an 11-to-1 vote. So all Democrats and all Republicans, with the exception of Rand Paul, voting for it. Now it's up to Leader Schumer, Chuck Schumer, to decide, does this come to the Senate floor? It's not yet even on the Senate floor. In the House, you've seen what Congressman Gallagher and the China Select Committee has done in support of Biosecure, but that committee does not have the ability to originate legislation. So you'd have to go back to a committee of jurisdiction, likely we think the House Oversight Committee, and you'd have to go through the full committee process. Then the speaker would have to decide to take it up on the floor. Then, of course, whatever reconciliation comes together, and then it would go to the White House.
Or it might get put into a defense authorization appropriations.
Exactly right. Exactly what I was going to say. With all that said, it's very unlikely, we think, for this to be a standalone piece of legislation. So whether it goes into a further appropriations bill or a defense authorization appropriations bill, there you're talking second half of the year toward the end of the year, if it does indeed progress. So nothing imminent, immediate, which again, why it's important for us to be able to shape the environment and to shape whatever legislation in a way that accomplishes the broad national security goals, but does it again in this thoughtful manner so that patients aren't harmed.
Well, great. Well, thanks, John. Thanks for taking so much time to really go into this in depth. We're going to take a little break now, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about all of the other things that you're doing at Bio that are really important.
All right. Thank you, Steve.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by... For more than 20 years, BioEquity Europe has been where CEOs and investors gather to network, partner, and debate critical issues facing the biotech industry. In 2024, BioEquity heads to San Sebastian, Spain, in Basque Country, May 12th to 14th. Join BioCentury, EBD Group, and Regional Host Committee Chair Iseos Capital in one of the world's culinary capitals for a destination event designed for CEOs, investors, and decision makers across the global biopharma ecosystem. In 2023, 300 VCs and 330 biotech CEOs joined BioEquity in Dublin, Ireland. In San Sebastian, the program will feature more than 100 emerging biotechs that will present their story to investors and potential partners. Don't wait, last year's BioEquity conference sold out. Visit bioequityeurope.com for more information.
I'm back with John Crowley, President and CEO of Bio. John, you've got an incredibly deep experience with rare disease drug development, as the founder and leader of a rare disease company, Amicus, and as the parent of 2 children who were born with a rare disease. I was really struck. I heard you speaking at the Reagan-Udall Foundation meeting a day or two before you came on board at Bio, and you said 2 things that really struck me. One was you said that you don't really like the term regulatory flexibility in relation to rare disease drug oversight, and you also said that you believe that FDA should have a center of excellence for rare diseases. Can you talk about both of those things? What you're thinking about this idea of regulatory flexibility? It's been bandied about a lot. And what you're thinking about what FDA needs to do to be responsive to the patients who desperately need more drugs for rare diseases and better drugs.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for highlighting it. And I'll begin with that point, right? There's over 10,000 rare diseases, very few of which have any approved therapies whatsoever. And many of those are, modestly effective, and we could do much better. When you think about the term regulatory flexibility, I don't like it because, in political and policy circles, and sometimes the general public, it implies a lower standard, kind of these poor kids, they have this rare disease, and maybe the drug helps, maybe it doesn't, but we'll let it go through. That's not what it is. You want the gold standard. You need safety and efficacy, and we need independent regulators to determine that. What we're actually asking for is regulatory sophistication, an elevation of regulatory science. We've had such remarkable advancements, and hopefully many more to come, in science and medicine, and regulatory science just has not kept pace. You look at, the whole notion of the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. You really can't do that in most rare diseases. It's just either not informative or not practical. So you need to think differently. You need to bring all the tools to bear. Peter Marks said, in fact, at our meeting there at Reagan-Udall several weeks ago, that, within his center at least, that accelerated approval will be the norm for gene therapies and other therapies as well. So think about how, when, and where do you use the accelerated approval pathways? How do you use biomarkers, natural history studies, Bayesian statistics, looking at totality of the data in the same way that a physician, an expert physician in a rare disease, might look at all the evidence presented for the safety and efficacy of a product. So we're not asking for a lower standard. We're asking the FDA to employ, higher levels of regulatory sophistication here.
And what about this frustration that I've heard from other companies that are developing drugs or trying to develop drugs for rare diseases, from patient groups? They feel that the standards at FDA aren't keeping pace, or that they aren't being applied consistently. And one of the ideas that's been brought up by the patient community is this idea of creating a center of excellence at FDA. Is that something that you personally favor? Is that something you think that Bio would advocate for?
Both. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, to think about each molecule and each disease through a separate risk-benefit analysis, because it's invariably going to be different. And you think about what we did at that, conference at Reagan-Udall, what we did, it was specific to one disease, MPS III, Sanfilippo disease, a rare, devastating, fatal brain disease in children, where you were seeing inconsistencies, CBER to CDER. You were seeing programs kind of picked apart in different areas. And what they did was they brought together literally the world's experts to talk. And it wasn't, and you could bring them in, and it's informative, and there was a patient perspective that's very important that was brought to bear. But this was at the core, it was about science and medicine, all of it together, the world's leading experts, all the companies working in the field, regulators together. And that's effectively what would have happened if you had a center of excellence or an institute at FDA where they're not the reviewers per se, and they're not issuing the actual approvals or denials. But they're bringing thought leaders together. They're bringing regulatory folks at a senior level, and they're bringing experts to bear, looking at a problem, thinking about, are we thinking about it the right way? Are we employing the right tools? Are you, the reviewers, getting the right guidance in terms of what is and what isn't appropriate in evaluating this disease with this molecule or these molecules? And that's not happening today. You're seeing, again, that inconsistency that you highlight, Steve, and you're seeing a lack of sophistication in terms of the latest and best regulatory science being applied for every one of these programs, bringing out the full arsenal that regulators should have. So I think, that institute or a center for excellence would go a long way towards solving some of those, most intractable problems.
So one of the things that I'm thinking about the conversation that you and I had when you first, like on one of your first days on the job, and you said that to enhance its influence, bio needs to move from transactional interactions with patient groups and with members of Congress to real long-term relationships with them. What did you mean by that, and how do you make it happen in both instances, with patient groups and with politicians?
Yeah, look, we've done a lot of great work, the organization, over the years, and we do have some good relationships in Congress. But when I look back over the last 20 plus years in this industry, what we need to get back to is a bit of the magic of bio and biotechnology. And part of that was sharing all the science and medicine, the patient needs, these breakthroughs. And, Jim Greenwood, one of my great predecessors, had once said, there's nothing in the laws of nature that says we can't cure every disease, only in the laws of man. So let's start thinking about breaking down those barriers. But you can't do that in these one-off meetings. They're part of it, right? The fly-ins that we do up on the Hill. Let's start doing those fly-outs that we talk about, going to the communities where our biotech companies are, where the patients live. And it's about, having those relationships where it's constant education and information sharing, so they understand exactly what is biotechnology and why is it so important for our nation and for the world. And that's an ongoing conversation, and we need to do a better job at that. And that's part of what I want to make sure we've got the resources at Bio to do, because I know the team is eager to do it.
And I think it's interesting you say that, because I've seen myself a tremendous amount of frustration with the lack of knowledge fundamentally of how the industry works, how a drug is discovered and developed, how the whole ecosystem works. There doesn't seem to be much understanding of that on Capitol Hill. And as a result of that, there seem to be decisions that are made that are well-intentioned, but that have really negative consequences for the industry.
Yeah, negative intended that are just misinformed, or lots of unintended consequences as well. We all want the same thing, right? We want medicines to cure our parents' Alzheimer's, to cure our children's cancer, rare disease. And so much of this is now increasingly within our grasp. I told lawmakers, I said, you want to take over the next year drug costs down and genericize everything. Let's just stop R&D. Well, we can't do that.
Yeah, everything would be cheaper now, but you would never get anything new.
Right. Right. But how much human suffering, would continue, how, detrimental to all the things we care about. So you don't want that. And then you start to get, of course, into all kinds of policy considerations around that. And that's a good part of what we need to do. But you're right, just the basics of what it takes to make a medicine. We've talked about my bio priorities. The first one, to advance and enlarge this virtuous circle of innovation with the patients at the center of the circle. And every part of it, our universities, our academic centers, regulators, small companies, angel investors, venture investors, large companies, all of it is necessary to make a medicine. And oftentimes when you complete that circle, which is rare, but when you do, oftentimes it's still very rarely a cure. It's a meaningful improvement.
You start all over again.
Right. And it gives patients time and quality of life. It gives the innovators a chance to go back and do even better. but just educating on that virtuous circle, what it takes is something we need to do more of.
So John, you talked about, you mentioned, doing flyouts, going out into the community and talking to people. Can you talk a little bit more about that? How are you thinking about kind of not only communicating Bio's priorities and its importance to the communities that benefit from Bio's products, but also hearing from people what they need and how you can bring that back to Washington to hopefully change policy?
Well, the idea of the flyouts is that we go out, we meet with, state legislators, but also members of Congress in their district with their companies. We highlight job creation, cures, and treatments being created. But in advance of that, Steve, what we're actually doing, what we instituted, are we're doing listening sessions, and we're calling it our Big Bold Ideas Initiative. Right now, this year, throughout 2024, we're going to be going to many, many cities in America, where I'll be there, senior members of the Bio leadership team, our member companies and non-member companies, from CEOs and other members of the organization, and having several hour roundtables where we talk about, what do they think, what are the top issues for them? And importantly, what would be the big issues? We did 21st century cures. There are elements of what we've gotten into some of the prior PDUFAs that really were meaningful. So what would on a big level make a difference? And, we've been to Miami and Raleigh and Usdin. We've got coming up in the next 60 days, we've got Boston, San Francisco, San Diego. We're working on scheduling Dallas, Chicago. So while we're in San Francisco, Boston, areas that are, the focus of much biotechnology, we're going to other cities as well that are emerging as biotech centers of excellence. So it's something I'm excited about, and we're hearing some great things. And I hope by early 2025, with whoever may be in the White House and with, a new Congress, that we can propose some big, bold ideas for Bio. And again, with the notion of being proactive and helping to set the agenda to heal, feed, fuel the world. That's ultimately what I think Bio can be, to be that convener and to be that voice of hope.
Well, that's really interesting, because I think it's really important to bring people together around a positive vision of where the United States needs to go with the bioeconomy. Because if you don't do that, the focus is always going to be on negative things. It's going to be
exactly right. And this is where
down.
let's take back the narrative, but let's also take back the initiatives.
We're living in a time when Republicans and Democrats disagree about just about everything, right? But there's one thing where there's common ground, and that's antipathy to drug companies. Can Bio change that, or do you just have to find a way to navigate through it?
No, I think we can change it, and that's part of our job, the perception. This is an amazing industry. Just telling the good that we do is necessary, but not sufficient. A lot of it comes down to our actions too. And, by that, I mean access. We talk a lot about innovation. Let's together talk about access to medicines, identify, break down the barriers to access. Let's start with the principle that nobody should ever go a day without the medicines they need. So for people who truly can't afford a $25 copay, figure out how to do away with it. Take rare diseases. People living with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cancer, rare disease, they've got enough skin in the game. So let's think about ways to break down those financial barriers for people, educational barriers. Let's also think about areas where we're dramatically underinvesting. One of my highest priorities is going to be women's healthcare. And it's endometriosis and cervical cancer and diseases unique to women, but more broad, more prevalent indications like autoimmune diseases, where there has been a remarkably disproportionate level of underinvestment in women-related and women-dominant healthcare issues.
Like lupus,
lupus, exactly. I think look, some folks, we could bang our heads against the wall explaining why 9 versus 13 in the IRA doesn't make any sense, and it's ultimately to the great harm of patients in the long run. And I hope we make progress there, but some folks just don't want to hear it. But when if you can find an area of common ground, and I think women's healthcare could be one of those areas, mental health could be one of those areas as well. We've got major problems to solve. Let's find ways to solve it together.
So how does that, how does that play out in a practical way? So there's an emphasis, you think there needs to be more emphasis, and nobody would disagree with it, I think, on women's health issues, on mental health issues. You go to the Hill, what's the ask? What is it that you're asking them to do? What is it that you're saying that the industry will do to help to advance these issues?
Again, I think it comes back to our core priorities of bio, advancing and enlarging that virtuous circle of innovation. And then we I think have spent as an industry far too little time talking about the barriers to access. Let's break those down one by one, and let's start to come up with thoughtful policies. I could tell you, my feeling as a board member for many years of bio was that sometimes we were a little too reactive, where there was an issue that came up, a proposed piece of legislation, and we reacted positively or negatively. We want to constantly be engaged with lawmakers, policymakers, be up on the Hill, but also get out of Washington and to go to the states and the state governors and legislators and communities and talk about these things and why this is such a great and amazing industry and such a, yes, strategic asset for the United States, but something that will do remarkable good for society broadly. I think once you explain that, you get into powerful storytelling, the who we are, who we serve, what we do, where we work, why we do what we do, and back it up with our actions. And that means continuing to make newer medicines, not a lot of these Me Too's and clever, creative IP games that some companies have played in the past, but really meaningful improvements in science and medicine, and then making sure that everybody has access. We could spend many a day talking about individual policies that will do that, and that's going to be part of my job, is to help prioritize which of those policies can have the greatest impact. So if there's an overarching theme to my tenure as Bio CEO, it's going to be focus and impact.
So you said a lot of people are not interested in the Hill or hearing about 9 and 13 on the IRA. What is it that when you do talk to members of Congress, one, what is it that you tell them is the impact of the drug pricing provisions of the IRA on innovation? And where are the realistic, if any, prospects for modifying the Medicare drug price negotiation program to make it so it has less unintended negative consequences for innovation?
Yeah, different pieces to that. So with the IRA, I think, Steve, our greatest opportunity is to highlight what was done in the orphan disease space, which I think was just a mistake. I don't even think that was misinformed. I know what they were trying to get at. That's where some companies playing games, leveraging the orphan indications for much larger indications, but that's not what they did in the legislation. You know exactly what the legislation says. You get a second orphan designation, not even an approval, and you get thrown into the IRA pricing scheme. So it's a massive disincentive for follow-on indications, which, there are many, 25+% of rare disease drugs get applied to other indications. So it's a disincentive to rare disease research, and that's wrong. So with the Orphan Cures Act now introduced bipartisan, House and Senate, I think there may be a pathway to reversing that mistake. 9 versus 13 was intentional. It wasn't a mistake, but I think it was misinformed. And the way that we change that, and I don't know that that's going to change in the near term, that may take some time. But I think it's exact case study showing people, where is venture capital going? Is it going more toward the biologic space or small molecules? Where are company portfolio decisions going? Which diseases are now going to be underinvested in? And take it down to the individual human level. And that's going to take time to articulate case studies, narratives, to share that. And I think once people see that, capital allocation is not perfect, but it's pretty rational. And I think we'll start to see evidence of this pretty soon too. So that's on the IRA, those two pieces. When it comes to the Medicaid, the drug rebate rule, that's now you're into a lot of rulemaking. We're engaging with the CMS director. You now got OMB, of course, involved. There's questions around stacking. For instance, you look at those, those provisions, the impact that they can have, again, against the totality of all, 340B, all these different pieces coming together. You're starting to see, for instance, with the stacking provisions, Areas where there's going to continue to be massive underinvestment, take mental health, take schizophrenia, where you're looking at like 55% discounts with all those stacked on together. In an era when we have such a mental health crisis, that's not what we want. And in my conversations with people who are, in charge of implementing all of this, that's not what they want either. So let's think about, before we rush into something with unintended consequences, let's at least gather the data and be thoughtful and not rush. And that's part of what we want to communicate as well, and be a partner with policymakers to make sure that anything that's now become law is implemented in a way where you eliminate or at least minimize these unintended consequences.
And so you think that gathering these case studies, gathering this evidence is something that you can use then to persuade
Exactly right.
members of Congress?
Take it down to, even Steve, to the individual human level. Tell stories of people living with disorders who no longer will have access to their medicine, or whose areas aren't going to be researched anymore. And I think people will realize, that's not what we intended. So let's think about another way to solve the problem. So let's at least slow down and make sure that whatever we implement, we get it right.
Great. Well, thanks, John. We've actually gone over the time that I had allocated for this conversation. We could talk all day, and in fact, I hope that we do. We have another conversation on the BioCentury show, and certainly for BioCentury. And thanks again.
Thank you, Steve.
Brought to you by the 24th BioEquity Europe, scheduled for May 2024 in San Sebastian, Spain. Join BioCentury EBD Group and Regional Host Committee Chair Isio's Capital for biotech's premier CEO and investor conference in one of the culinary capitals of the world. Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.